guest. Dear students, dear colleagues and friends, actually I'm a bit affected by seeing so many of you in an auditorium. It's been a great while that we have seen such filled auditoria, and it thrills me. And actually the last time, also in this auditorium, we had a big activity. It was on March the 8th, where we had a conference in the presence of Nobel Peace Prize laureate Rigoberta Menchú, with also some, like now, some 300-400 young people present. And it affects me, and also the theme affects me because the Peace Jam weekend was devoted to peace and peace, making young people agents of change towards a world with more peace. And now we are here together in order to talk about a war situation in Europe. Some 1,800 kilometers from Brussels, the capital of Europe, another European capital, Kiev, is being surrounded and besieged. And every day we see images which we thought we would never see again in Europe, of residential areas that have been shot at, fleeing people, refugees, women, children mostly, fallen soldiers, casualties on both sides. They are images that until recently we would not have believed possible on the European continent, a European country falling victim of a military invasion from a neighboring country. Each of us are questions. That's probably why you're here. How could this happen? Why, except maybe a few of the experts here present, why didn't we see it, that it would be arriving? Why did this conflict escalate? Will the war spread to other countries, to other continents? What will the international institutions, the European Union and others, NATO, do? What can they do? What can we do? No fewer than 145 nationalities are represented on our campuses. There are students and colleagues on our campus from both Ukraine and Russia. We can hardly imagine what you, probably few of you are in the room here, are going through these days. Fear for family, friends, fear from uncertainty, fear from the future. Our VUB community consists of people from the direct neighboring countries of Russia and Ukraine, also Poland, Romania. I assume they are also very worried about what is arriving, the flow of refugees that is arriving in their home countries. In our VUB community, there are students and colleagues who themselves come from the areas that are at war or where war has recently reigned. These images from Ukraine are also for them brutal reminders of the injustice called war. For all these reasons, it's important that we listen to experts in the field who are trying to get a grip on what's going on, who can provide background information and help us understanding what's happening. It is sometimes said that truth is the first casualty of a war. And a book that made a deep impression upon me when I was a young man, I was reading it some decades ago, was Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. Ingredients which he later also introduced in his more famous book, 1984, and where he describes how he was a volunteer in the international brigades, and where he described when he came back on leave from the front to Barcelona, and battles were described which never took place, because he was where the battles were, and he knew that on both sides the truth was being. So today we are overwhelmed with information of which is not always easy to estimate its accuracy. And that is why it's important that experts in the field share their knowledge and insights with us. Tonight, we will certainly also talk about what we as a VUB community can do. Many initiatives have already been launched, and a page has been created on which you will find an overview, and I'm sure it will be displayed later on. Before giving the floor to the experts, I would like to thank the members of the panel for their participation. I know how busy you are, how solicited you are by the media all the time, and we truly appreciate the efforts which you do. Thank you. I would also like to thank the people, Markom, who made the organization of the event possible. And last but not least, I would like to thank you, the audience, for being present here tonight. Faced with injustice such as war, we all feel sometimes powerless, not knowing what to do. That is why it is important that we come together, listen to each other, talk to each other. But I'm also sure that some of the colleagues in the panel will develop that further in the debate. We should stand up to defend our values. Human rights, equality, solidarity, the rule of law, freedom in its forms, freedom of expression, freedom of press, they form the basis of our liberal democracies. We cannot take them for granted, that we know now. Each of us can make the difference to someone or something in one way or another, in your own, or even better, together with others. As VUB, as a university that aspires to be an urban engaged university, we sometimes use the hashtag, the world needs you, de wereld heeft je nodig, and that is certainly the case today. The world needs us, we can make the difference, absolutely. Dear friends, I wish you all a very interesting and inspiring evening, and I truly regret that I cannot stay any longer, but I have to do a family visit in the hospital, and which doesn't allow me to stay longer, but have a fruitful evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Wendy van den Broek. I'm a professor here at the Communication Studies Department at VUB, and I'm also the current program director of the Bachelor in Social Sciences program. I will be moderating the panel discussion this evening, but before I invite the panel members on stage, we will first try to set up a virtual connection with one of our alumni students from the Bachelor Social Sciences program, Artem Kyzym. We will try to see whether everything works, so we will try to bring him on screen. Okay. It's not in the call. Yeah, but he's still not in the call. Okay, so apparently we have some connection problems with Artem. We will see whether we can introduce him later into the discussion. So then I invite the panel members on stage immediately. So please welcome and take a seat. Okay, so welcome on stage. It is my honor to introduce to you our four panel members for this evening. Professor Dr. Romain Meeusen is then we go to the call first. Yeah, okay, sorry. That's what happens with technology.
Okay.
Let's go.
That's a busy professor's agenda.
Okay. Artem, good evening. Can you hear and see us?
Yep, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Professor?
Okay, thank you for joining Artem. I already introduced you as one of our alumni from the Bachelor in Social Sciences program, but you're currently studying in Zurich, if I'm not mistaken, Master Comparative and International Studies, and you're also involved in the NGO Promote Ukraine. Thank you for joining us this evening. Could you briefly share your perspective on the current events with us?
Yes, of course. First of all, dear students, professors, and members of the panel, thank you very much for having me. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to the organizing team for putting together this event in light of the broad developments of the situation in Ukraine. So my address on this topic will be brief, concise, and to the point. On the 24th of February at 4 a.m., residents of Kiev, Kharkiv, and Kyzym, among other cities, woke up to the retaliatory fire. War had begun. For the past 3 weeks, our brave soldiers have been defending Ukraine on 3 fronts: against an army that is technologically and numerically superior
Thank you, Artem, for joining us this way and for sharing this statement, and for also giving some advice to the audience on how they can contribute in different ways. We will talk about this further in the panel discussion later on as well. But thank you for joining, and take care. Okay, and then we will continue with the introduction of our panel members. So on the right of me, we have Professor Romain Meeusen, who is currently our vice-rector of internationalization, and who will share with us what VUB is doing with regards to the conflict. So we will hear more about that later on. Next, we have Olesya Tkacheva. She is a research professor in data science at the Brussels School of Governance here at VUB. And her research focuses on the Russia-NATO relations and the effects of digital technologies on international relations. She will also share her perspective with us later on in the discussion. Professor Holslag, he's an expert in diplomatic history and international relations, also professor, of course, here at VUB, and he's also guest lecturer at several foreign universities and at NATO's highest training college for generals. And then last we have Professor Alexander Mattelaer, Vice Dean for Research at the Brussels School of Governance and Research Fellow at Egmont, which is the Belgian Royal Institute for International Relations. And here at VUB he teaches courses related to European Union and master-level courses on diplomacy and international security. And his research is mainly focusing on defense policy making and strategic affairs. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the discussion this evening. I will immediately show a map on the screen as well. First question maybe for you, Professor Mattelaer. We are now 3 weeks ahead in this conflict, in this war. In retrospect, why were all the attempts of preventing this terrible conflict unsuccessful?
Many thanks, Wendy. I'm also just thinking about what Artem just said, and the magnitude of the challenge that the Ukrainian people now find themselves in. It is a dire situation, and against that background, I think we also need to be a bit self-critical about how we got here, because the transition from peace to war does not come all out of the blue. This has been building up for many, many years, and yet collectively here in Europe we did not see it. And I like to draw everyone's attention to perhaps 3 moments in time when we should have started thinking about this more clearly, because the fact that there has emerged a deeply political conflict between Moscow and the West, it has been at least 15 years in the making. Think about Vladimir Putin's now infamous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, when he essentially provided us with a 15 years warning about what now in retrospect was coming. The year after, Jonathan and I authored an op-ed sort of raising the alarm bells about what was going on, and at the time no one took us seriously. If we fast forward to 2014, there was already a limited conflict in Ukraine that was not resolved in any satisfactory way, neither for Kiev, nor for Moscow, nor for the West, for that matter. It just kept on festering. And unfortunately, collectively, in the West, in Europe, in different European capitals and chancelleries, we looked away all too often. Most recently, in the course of last December, the Russian government essentially presented its set of diplomatic ultimatums, and we were shocked. Some of our top-level diplomats were wondering, is this really happening? And at that point in time, the search for trying to think through what was happening started in earnest, But really, with the benefit of hindsight, it was too late, because the pieces had been set, they had already been moving. And I think the main response that we articulated in that time frame, so December, January, was threatening sanctions to change the calculus in the Kremlin not to do this. And that failed. That strategy of trying to convince the Kremlin not to do this, it was not successful. And now we are implementing those sanctions, even though they will end up hurting ordinary Russian people just as much as the Russian leadership. And we are struggling to think through where we need to go from here. So I think the case should be, we really need to rethink our whole diplomatic approach and how we handle the problem, because clearly we've made a mess of things. I'll perhaps leave it at that for starters and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, we made a mess. Do you agree? Should we have done more?
Yeah, definitely so. I share the analysis of Alexander completely. I would perhaps even go a step further. I think war has always continued to be with us, but it's only coming closer. We have had Russians shelling Aleppo, we have had Russians doing things in the Caucasus that opened the eyes already of many people dealing with security in European capitals. But it was still far enough away, so we preferred to keep the oil and gas flows at a high enough level. We also expected that as long as we talked and engaged the Russians, that they would backtrack from further aggression towards Ukraine. Then 2014 happened. Sanctions, very limited. Impact on the Russian economy was below 1% of its GDP. And it didn't take more than half a year before the first big oil companies from Europe stood again on the doorstep of the Kremlin to beg for more contracts in the high north around Yamal, including several Belgian delegations, by the way. And we knew that all this economic engagement was not putting a brake on Russia's expansionist logic, its imperial visions for its surrounding. And what for me has been very disturbing throughout is that our diplomats and certain other services have relayed since 2015, I think, very explicit, well-documented and clear-worded assessments of the risk. Sometimes they were just brushed aside, as Alexander said. In case of several European member states, they were censored. And we have evidence now of the Chancellor's office in Berlin having prevented some of these assessments to go to the Bundestag, to the Parliament. So the political responsibility that we have collectively, especially in Western European Union, is colossal. And if we talk about impunity and so forth with regard to war crimes, which is very much important, I think also we should have some very tough questions being asked in parliamentary commissions in the next months, in the next years, because self-criticism is due. And if we don't learn from the mistakes of the past, if we don't get to explain why we turn our sight away, I think it might well happen that Europe will not ultimately rise to the challenge, and that after this crisis again we will relapse into pragmatism. Of course, we will say that we aim at strategic autonomy and reducing dependency, but the urgency will disappear. And that, I think, is very much a concern. But this war is the result of 30 years of looking away, of opportunism, and censoring. I would really use the word censoring assessments coming from different parts of the government.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you both say diplomacy failed. We're now in a violent conflict. Will diplomacy get us a way out of it, and how do you see that?
Well, we have entered a situation in which military pressure is essentially pushing a very hard form of diplomacy forward, because war is ultimately a clash of political wills that will eventually exhaust itself in function of available material resources. How that will play out, we do not know. What we do know is, from a European perspective, there is palpable fear in the air, because we actually know that the issue that drives Vladimir Putin, it is not just what is going on in Ukraine, it is the European, the Euro-Atlantic appeal in general that is troubling him the most. And we may say we are not a military party to this conflict, but via the sanctions that we are imposing, the political rhetoric that we use, it is hard to say that we are staying completely neutral and standing aside from all of this. So I think at heart the logic must be, well, there is ultimately a serious risk that this war, which is currently still a limited war, can still become a much bigger, even nastier war. That is something that we can still prevent via strong deterrence that will also provide us with the freedom to consider what is actually the most difficult decision of all, namely, how far do we lean forward in assisting Ukraine to fight its way through all of this? Because ultimately, there are three choices. Assuming we manage to contain the military part of the conflict in Ukraine and deter Russia from going further, ultimately the three choices are, we can say we're not really going to support Ukraine, and then ultimately Ukraine will at some point fall. We can do completely the opposite and say we assume all possible escalatory risk and we are going to help Ukraine fight its way through this, which is a very delicate undertaking. There is also the path in between, which is in many ways the most likely to happen, but perhaps the worst possible outcome for all Ukrainian people caught in the middle, that is that we assist Ukraine somewhat, not enough to actually help them win, not enough to really take too much escalatory risk, but really to provide some support to strike a balance, but with the ultimate outcome of that policy being that the war drags on, that it just sort of festers, that all the support just fuels a prolonged stalemate and prolonged suffering. So against that background, either the very cynical do as little as possible, or the more activists do as much as possible is probably better, but there are politically very different courses of action that we haven't really started to grapple with. And before we can even have that conversation from a European and a broader Western point of view, we probably have to make sure that our own defense is at least ready for managing the escalatory risk that we face in any case.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, Putin yesterday claimed that his military operation is going as planned. Do you believe that?
Well, I think there is no denying that the Russian military operation, the war, the campaign failed in many different ways. Now, combining that question with your previous one, I think it's very important to highlight that from the eyes of the Kremlin, Russia is waging a war not that much against Ukraine, but against the West, with the only difference that Western weapons at this time are being carried by and operated by Ukrainians. That's the analysis that I think folks in the Kremlin make. The Russian public opinion for the time being is still a bit divided about it. Most of the Russians do not support the invasion of Ukraine as such, but tend to agree with the fact that the West has been sort of containing Russia and that this is the moment for Russia to fight back. If the West supplies arms, well, then it shouldn't come as a surprise that more civilians die, that the conflict escalates, and that Russia sort of resorts to harsher means. So, first of all, that's, I think, a calculus that is growing in Russia. We see the dissidents, we see the protesters. We know that the Russian elite, there are some kind of small fissures at the moment, but that's the approach. As a result of that, I think that the diplomatic trajectory at this moment is advancing, but on the matters in the periphery, not on the core issues, being the independence of the two republics, extended, very important, and the recognition of the Crimean seizure. There is a lot of pressure internationally on both sides to be forthcoming. From the West on the Ukrainian government, but very important, I think, here is also the tacit, subtle role that the Chinese play. We read in the press quite often, okay, the Chinese are sort of considering military support, the Chinese are circumventing sanctions, but there is growing evidence that besides the refusal to drop Putin and to openly criticize the Russians, that the Chinese also relay the message to the Russian government, watch out, as Alexander also hinted at, you risk overstretch, you risk exhaustion, and our main concern is the continued stability of the Russian Federation. That's a very important message towards Putin. The Chinese do not isolate him, but they sort of quietly, subtly relay their concern. Whether that's going to be enough to get the two sides moving towards a compromise on Donbass and the Crimea, very hard to say. I think at the very least, Putin is going to want to get these two prices. About the rest you can discuss, but that remains core demand. How then to assess the Russian campaign? I think there has been blundering and faltering at the beginning. But on the other side, there has also been crucial support from the United States. I think what the Americans have been doing in providing situational awareness to the Ukrainians, in the training that took place in the last 5 years, like the covered training program that the Americans rolled out with regard to intel, special operations, but also more broadly, I think is now really paying off in Ukraine. So that also, I think, explains for the Russian losses. What's going to happen? At this moment, it's slowing down. We suspect that it's a combination of tough defense, but also Russian kind of recalibration of the whole battle plan, and that Russia still has kept a lot of its power dry. There is exhaustion in different ways, but Russia still also has a lot of things that it can throw. That goes from fielding more of its artillery near to Kiev, and that's happening as we speak. We see more of the MLRS systems, the rocket launchers coming close, more of the howitzers coming close. We also see reorganization of some of the air capabilities in Belarus, and that's not reassuring. At the same time, you see that stockpiles of long-range missiles in the west of Russia, around Voronezh, are being again expanded. So you can clearly see that in spite of the diplomatic talks, Russia is digging in and is readying for a long-term war. Now then you have Alexander's point. If we keep supplying arms and it becomes very much protracted and Russia continues to suffer from more casualties, 7,000 up, the most moderate estimations, there is going to be escalation. Yeah. And the only possible tool that Russia has is the tactical nuclear threat. And then you have to ask, okay, how do we respond to that? First of all, how is that threat going to become manifest? Is it going to be posturing? Is it actually going to be the use of one of these 1,000 miniaturized nuclear warheads that Russia has, only the miniaturized ones, not the big ones? And that's a very tough thing. NATO has kind of reflected upon that. Alexander has also spent a lot of time on that issue. But what are we going to do if one of these tactical weapons splashes, let's say, in not so densely populated rural area? Not many casualties, but still the signal being very strong. What's going to be the next step? I'm of the opinion that if the war continues to protract, exact more casualties on both sides, and the diplomatic channel gets stuck still because of no breakthrough on Donbass and the Crimea, ultimately the tactical nuclear thing is going to become very, very pressing.
Okay, thank you. President Zelensky is also asking for a no-fly zone. What is your opinion on that?
It's not enforceable. If you want to impose a no-fly zone, you have to knock out all the Russian air defense systems that are in the Belarus, that are partially in Transnistria, that are, of course, also in Russian territory. You're going to have aerial operations in Ukrainian airspace. We are not going to do that. And frankly, we are not capable of doing that. I think for the Americans with their capacity, which is mostly F-15s that rotate around Europe, it's not enough. And then if you consider that you have to do it in highly contested environment with Russian air defense system, then you would likely have to have F-35s, F-22s. We don't have that at the moment. Okay, there is a new carrier coming through the Atlantic our way, and at some moment we're going to have 2 American carriers in Europe's vicinity, and they will have some planes that are more useful. But we are not going to do that. It's going to be such a step in the escalation that this is really going to give Russia only one option, and that is to go the nuclear way. That's my assessment, but perhaps Alexander has
to be honest,
different ideas.
I worry less about the nuclear factor, because it is agreed language that any use of nuclear weapons against a NATO ally would fundamentally alter the nature of conflict, which is code word for saying, if that happens, it is tit for tat. So I think in Moscow they know that. The escalation that I worry about is the operational objective of the entire operation was to denazify Ukraine. Regime change is the driving operational goal, and the regime sits in Kiev. So the escalation that I worry about, if you look at the map, it is the vulnerability of the Russian supply line coming from the east, from Sumy. So I think the escalation that I would now worry about the most is that the northeastern quadrant of the Ukrainian territory gets treated like a killing box.
Sure.
That is going to happen in the coming weeks, because it is the only way of trying to force through military means, the fall of Kiev.
No, but I absolutely agree with that, and you're going to have different layers of escalation. The most important and the most evident one is that Russia will add to its effort to have this 360-degree siege on Kiev, and therefore you're going to have different corridors, and the means necessary to protect and safeguard these corridors are going to be more drastic. I think also the kind of warfare is going to be much more offensive, and is going to lead us to a kind of element that has always intrigued me in Russia military doctrine, and that's saturation and attrition. Mm-hmm. Like, we come from an age that we in the West got to expect that warfare was going to be surgical, that bombings, okay, we also made mistakes from time to time, but that we had to avoid civilian casualties and collateral damage. In Russian military doctrine, there is a lot of emphasis put on attrition and saturation, mass artillery campaigns, mass missile campaigns, and they consider that an inevitable part of warfare. And I think that's very much also in line with Alexander's assessment. When I talk about nuclear escalation, I do not necessarily refer to the threat against NATO, like missile launches against NATO member states. I'm more talking about the use of small tactical missiles on Ukrainian soil. And for that too, you have a lot of kind of hooks and concepts in Russian military doctrine. And that's what the Russian military strategy, but certainly also the nuclear doctrine says, if conventionally Russia gets threatened on key interests, then it reserves itself the right to use tactical nuclear weapons. It's very transparent about that. And throughout the years, generals very high up have reiterated that again and again and again. Ukraine is not NATO. Okay, we cannot take for granted that it will happen, but it's part of the doctrine. Russia has its systems deployed. They are second level of alertness now. And calculus in terms of using that changes. It's not inevitable, but you have to be ready for that. What do we do if that comes? Even if it splashes somewhere in Ukrainian countryside and you have virtually no casualties. It's also, I think, bringing us to another element in Russian military doctrine, and that's counter-value, like going against or intimidating civilians and the populations to the point that they will beg for peace. Intimidate, wearing out civilians. From a Western opinion, that's the kind of warfare that you cannot defend. But for the Russians, that's the kind of warfare that we have seen since Boris Yeltsin essentially went into the Caucasus.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we have seen that the Western nations have imposed severe restrictions or severe sanctions on Russia. Olesya, you've did some research on this. You also prepared some slides related to this. Can you explain us a bit more about these sanctions and about the effect of these sanctions?
I'll try. Is my mic working? Okay.
Perfect.
So I guess my task was a little bit dividing labor, looking at Russia and internal dynamics, what's happening in Russia and how is they reacting to the sanctions that we imposed. And I understand that this is the room where usually people take tests and I have a quiz for you. This is a picture, like what is on the picture? And I have already a hint. So it's not the cue to get sugar, not yet, or tobacco products. This is run on banks in Russia 3 days after the beginning of the war in Ukraine. These people in Moscow lining up to get cash from ATM machines, okay? The question is it getting us, or are the sanctions working, or are they working the way we anticipate them to work? And can I have the next slide, please? And to give you an idea, we've been remarkably united, and this is unprecedented level of resolve, let's put it this way, to use available tools, barring the direct intervention and sending troops to assist the country, which we believe is a valuable strategic partner for Europe. And the sanctions could be, not the sanctions, also measures could be divided into, for example, very unprecedented measure which froze Russia's bank hard currency reserves. So the way it works, all countries, they have their hard currencies allocated in different banks, and Russia stored in dollars and euros close to 53% of its hard currency reserve, and this is reserves that Putin was counting on to use to offset the upcoming measures, and we decided to freeze it, okay? So that was rather unexpected blow to Russian economic elite, to Putin himself. But on top of that, we went after oligarchs, we went after banks, we banned them from using SWIFT, which is the network for facilitating the transactions. But it did not stop at that, because we saw lots of grassroots level at the companies pulling out from Russia. Okay, starting from Amazon, Apple, Google, going to car manufacturers, luxury good producers. So there was a unanimity and solidarity in how the West responded to that. We kicked Russia from, we suspended Russia's privileged position as the privileged country at World WTO organization, and yada, yada, yada. So the good news, if we believe that we're not doing enough, we're doing definitely much more than we've done in the past in a very short amount of time, okay? Because the war has been going only for 20 days, and all those measures were rolled out within first week, okay? Given that we had enough notice. Can I just have a next slide to give you an idea? Now, Russia is the most sanctioned nation in the world. So there is a dashboard that the Atlantic Council puts together, and it shows you the spike from the 2014 sanctions that we introduced after the annexation of Crimea to current levels. So it went from 2,000 sanctions about to more than 5,000 and more than 30 countries. And those 30 countries account for 50% of the world GDP. Okay, so we are doing what we can. We are still considering additional measures that are going to impact Russia's energy sector. Okay, now, the immediate impact on the Russian economy was the shutting down of the Russian stock market. It's been closed already for 3 weeks, the longest since the 1998. This is the bottom level for the Russian economic downturns. We saw the collapse of the ruble exchange rate vis-a-vis dollar and euro. We also saw tightening of and kicking in the commodity and food markets rationing out, right? So people having hard time buying sugar, buying bread. So there is certain uncertainty and anxiety among the Russian consumers, okay? Now, next slide. So here is the idea, so what's happening to Moscow. And the reason I put these two pictures, one picture to my right is the line from the Soviet times when people were queuing to buy food, okay? I remember that time. I grew up behind the Iron Curtain. And then this one to the IKEA, with IKEA sign, this is the Russian consumers reacting to the fact that IKEA is pulling out and closing down all their stores. Well, okay, so this is the luxury goods, these are necessities. Are we close to the Soviet type of shortages? Not yet, okay? The bad news, so this is kind of good news, the bad news. We tend to associate and we reference this war as Mr. Putin's war. Unfortunately, there is substantial share of the Russian population that perceives his actions as consistent with what is good for the country and are willing to tolerate economic hardship in order to restore Russia's position in the global order, to regain the prestige and power. So we have to understand that in the system which is becoming increasingly totalitarian, believing the polls becomes problematic, but so you also calibrate from different sources and different types of polls. But I would say, we could say close to 50% of the population believe that it's a good idea to use force to protect the Russian-speaking population in Lugansk and Donetsk, and they expect Russia to win because of the military superiority, and they also perceive that Ukraine is a security threat to Russia, okay? So it's convenient to have the discourse at the level of this is Mr. Putin, but we should stop and ask, okay, is it just Mr. Putin or is it a large share of the Russian population? And then what implications does it have after Putin steps down eventually, okay? And the last slide is what is happening to Russia is going to have direct implications for the type of neighbor that we're facing. So Putin has been using this opportunity to tighten control over the civil society, which was already rather weak and substantially weakened since the 2014. And we see lots of measures that resemble Stalinization, which could be called, which includes close to 15,000 people already are imprisoned for pro-peace protests. So within this 3-week period, 15,000 civilians were jailed because they were anti-war. We also see more drastic measures controlling the freedom of information, freedom of speech, with measures like you can get 15 years in prison for using the word war, because this operation, this aggression towards Ukraine is called special operation in Donetsk and Luhansk. And whatever happens in Ukraine, I'm very skeptical that they will be reversal. So we are facing more aggressive and less democratic and more totalitarian regime right on our borders, militarized population, okay? And the other questions that I want to ask ourselves, are the sanctions enough? And for me, you have to understand Russia's people pain thresholds. For us, okay, so we're doing unprecedented level of effort to slow down and to hurt certain areas of the Russian economy. But for the Russian people, the point of reference for many of them is the 90s, when the Soviet system collapsed and they were going through enormous disruptions of logistic supplies and food and even like basic necessities. So 90s, 98 is the time when Putin, actually year preceding when Putin came to power, were the worst periods in the Russian economy. And we're not near where that for the time being. Okay, well, this is 3 weeks, it's too soon to say, to tell. And so here we are. We should be looking for additional ways to impose pressure on the Russian economy, and we should not be shying away to closing loopholes when it comes to sanctioning oligarchs. How about going after members of their families and their distant and immediate family members? So we have not been touching that part to a certain extent. And the last slide, it's more like what can we do? And talking about the amount of pain and suffering that we see in Ukraine, and we have to remember the way how Russia was conducting operations in Syria, okay? They leveraged the fact that they could weaponize civilians and send them to Europe and to affect our internal domestic processes. So I checked data today. According to the official statistics, 3 million Ukrainians crossed the EU borders, okay? These 3 million came here within 3-week interval, right? We have to be prepared to accommodate extremely high demand for social services, for medical services, for education, for housing here within a very short period of time. And then the question becomes, what can we do and how can we channel this in a more productive rather than destructive energy that we're facing? Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I think it's a good opportunity to give the
Okay,
floor.
thank you, Olesya, for sharing that perspective. What can we do? An important question. Romain, I'm looking at you now. What can we do as a university? What is the policy of VUB at this moment regarding the conflict?
Well, as soon as the conflict started, first thing we did was to see, do we have students or academia in Russia or in Ukraine? Lucky we didn't have any, because I have a quite strict travel policy, and because of that students couldn't go out of the EU for this year. I'm sorry for that, but we were a bit lucky. If not, it would be difficult to get people out of there. And immediately I reached out to, because we were at a strategic seminar in Ostend with the deans and the vice-rectors, I asked my services to locate all the Ukrainian and Russian students that we have. And we have 25 Ukrainian students and 90 Russian students, and reach out to them by mail and ask if we could help with whatever. That was on Thursday, actually the day that the war broke. Is that me? The war broke out, and we got some answers, about 30-ish answers with questions from Russian students, for instance, because during the weekend already they were feared that they couldn't get any money from the bank or from their parents and so on. So we're dealing with that. That's the first thing we did. In the weekend there were also already statements of Utopia, of VLIR and CREF. VLIR is the Flemish Inter-University Council, meaning that unites the Flemish University. CREF is the same for the Wallon side. And they had a mutual statement, but also all the other international educational boards made a statement. First, a bit soft, I would say, just in the beginning, but then, of course, I think it was the 4th of March, all the Russian rectors declared a statement where they stood behind their leader, and that gave a cascade of all the European universities to ban all the connections with the Russian universities. In the meantime, there were also individual academics that sent messages that they were not the regime. So there's a difference, I think, also at that level. But nevertheless, also VLIR follows that statement, meaning that we will not have any agreements or any other interaction scientifically. Also, the FWO follow this, and the EU, meaning that there's also a ban on, let's say, scholarships sponsored by EU for Russian students coming over. That's the situation we're dealing with. For me, a VUB student is a VUB student, wherever he or she comes from, however he or she looks like, or however they behave. They're human beings, young human beings at the university where freedom of speech is very important and where interaction with each other is very important. So we want to help every student. But it's a bit difficult, of course. That's why we also still are looking on getting all the facilities ready when academia or students will come over. We are interacting with student affairs, with R&D department to see what we can prepare, because now for the moment there are only a few requests of people doing a PhD to finish their PhD, maybe their last year at a European university. There's a website, Science for Ukraine, that has, I didn't look this afternoon, but has about 100 job opportunities all over the world for PhD students, postdocs or other. So they're well, or subsidized or another way. So it's just a website where you can go to as a VUB professor and just list, I can offer my lab to someone in this specialization if they want to continue their research. I saw last that there are already some of VUB professors that made a post on that. Most of those are in Europe, of course, but it's all over the world. So that's already something we joined immediately. And last Thursday I had a terrible feeling because I had so many mails for solidarity, and at a certain stage many people were almost doing the same thing at the same time. So we had to coordinate. There's one email address where conflict.ukraine@vub.be, where you can come in with questions, and we dispatch the questions. And we created in De Wereld Heeft Je Nodig a website where everybody who wants to do an action for help can put his item on, so that people can find each other there. Another thing is what we did. So we did quite a bit, I think. What we did is to have a meeting of the Caroline Pauwels Noodfonds, so the emergency funds of the rector, because that supports students that are in need of whatever. There are rules for that, and we first of all had a campaign asking people to donate money, also especially for Ukrainian or even other students. And we are now looking to soften a bit the rules so that maybe we can do more than the things we do now. I know housing has a few rooms that we might be able to use for people, students or academia that comes in. We are also looking on how we can prepare incoming students for next year already, because I think it will be a bit difficult to register for classes after Easter. We activated the in-campus project. The in-campus project is an inclusion project that we created after the Syria war with all the refugees, where we supply psychological support. We offer Nederlands lesson, but I think that's a bit difficult. So I'm trying to convince also the VUB to liberate some money so that we can provide, for instance, English lessons, intensive courses, already preparing students that register for next year. So we'll need some extra money, and I think we need to invest money in helping people this time. It's the thing we as VUB can do is to embrace people that come here that are fugitives and help them the most we can do. So I think that's a bit all we did. And also the MNO, so the personnel service, is looking into the possibility to put some people to work at VUB, and they will also try to fund that so that they can have some work experience at VUB, but also in Belgium. Let me have a look, because I had a whole list. I think that's also the rector ad-interim and I will have a lunch with the Ukrainian students. We'll invite them for a small sandwich lunch and make sure that they meet each other and connect with each other. We'll do the same for the Russian students so that they also can meet and share their problems that they're having, because I think we still need to be convinced that it's a regime that is acting. But if we hear that 50% of the people are supporting, that means that also 50% of the people are not supporting what Putin is doing. And I think also our individual scientists, although there's a ban for the interaction between universities, I think individual scientists that have connections with individual professors, and they can interact and let our professors, they are wise enough to judge if they continue collaborating or not. Last thing that I say, we were having collaborations, we are still, but I'll finish my sentence, with the Moscow Aviation Institute and ITMO in St. Petersburg. Those are universities that have a really military task. And next Tuesday, I have a Council of Internationalization, and we will stop all memoranda of understanding or whatever we have with those two military universities.
Okay, thank you, Romain. Indeed, a lot of initiatives. You also see the websites listed there, and if students or staff, if you have individual initiatives that you want to share, you can also mention them via the websites. I think we can open the floor for questions from the audience. Now there are two students with microphones, so if you have a question, just raise your hand, and then they will come with a microphone. Yes. No microphones? Okay. Ja. Los nou met een adem.
Test? No? Okay. So I think my question is mostly directed at Professors Mattelaer and Holslag. I think that China is watching everything that's happening with some interest. My question is, if Russia's undertaking goes somewhat well, I fear that China might attempt the same in Taiwan. How does this need to end to deter China from trying anything similar?
Jonathan, do you want to address the question?
Okay. Well, that's of course a very big question. China has been watching the war cautiously, and I think also has been reminded that taking a country is not evident. And that certainly if you try to control urban complexes that are ready to fight, that this comes at a price. Now, having that said, China is going to take Taiwan sooner or later, but it's not in a hurry. If it's up to the Chinese, they will still seize the access they have to global markets, to internationally available technology, to research and development at universities throughout the world, to strengthen their position, to modernize their military, to inch in on the United States, which is still quite a job, I would say, and then ready for working towards the reunification of the motherland, as they call it, which of course has ramifications into Taiwan. The difference between Russia and China, of course, is that it already has an economy 11 times bigger, I think, that its armed forces are larger, better equipped, I would say, and that there is a willingness to fight. If the Ukrainians are still the Russians a bit hesitant and divided about Ukraine, the Chinese, and you can say it's propaganda, but then it's perhaps the result of propaganda, are much more supportive of reunification, if necessary, by military means. So I think we ought to see that now, however tragic it is, we have a decaying regional power that attacks a country, which I think is largely the appetizer, so to say, for a much more fundamental power shift across Eurasia in the coming decades. So I think what we ought to do is to reconsider relations with Russia, evidently, but also to ask ourselves whether we want to continue to do business with another authoritarian regime that puts hundreds of thousands of minority people in prison and has a profoundly revisionist agenda. Do we want to grant access to our market, as it was the case in the last decades? Do we want to grant access to our universities? Because we still have a raft of synergies between Flemish universities and Chinese defense-related research institutes. So it's, I think, part of a much bigger contest that we're going to have geopolitically, but essentially also between authoritarian states and I think a minority of liberal democratic states, to see the bigger picture. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's a question over there.
This conflict, or this special operation of Mr. Putin, has become something which has reached really a global scale. And then I'm wondering, there is somewhere a big international global organization with a council also where important people meet, and they have even peacekeeping forces, etc. I'm making allusion to something I think people understand. And is this going to remain a powerless giant, or is it not a giant? I would like to hear the opinion of Jonathan and Alexander about this, or. So the role of the UN in this.
No, happy to pitch in on that. The United Nations organization is, of course, the cornerstone of how international law is operationalized, with all members of the UN having committed themselves to the UN Charter. With what is currently happening in Ukraine, I think it does not require much argumentation to illustrate that Russia is actually violating its own commitments it has under the UN Charter. But as far as the institution is concerned, the highest body of the United Nations is the Security Council, which features 5 permanent members with veto power. One of them is Russia. So Russia can exempt itself from any sort of sanction that the United Nations could otherwise issue if it were another regime. Now, we have seen that the UN General Assembly has mobilized, has criticized Russian actions vigorously. That resolution was supported by an overwhelming majority of United Nations members. But unfortunately, Russia can shrug its shoulders and say, well, we just put up with that criticism. So unfortunately, I fear that we should not look for much substantial movement from the UN front. Now, if I may also add a point on the way in which we, as a university, manage all of this, because some of the scientific collaborations that Romain already referred to, and I would like to salute all the efforts of our international relations in playing really in really following up on this very, very closely and taking all these actions. We were also reviewing such collaborations only recently in the ethics committee in which we deal with potentially sensitive collaborations, and that was in January, and I was already thinking at that time, like, this is perhaps not very prudent. And I think we also have to come to terms with the fact that tension in the international system is now dramatically increasing, and it is affecting the way we operate as academic institutions, because we are ultimately in the knowledge management business. We expand knowledge through research and pass it on to the next generation. I mean, that's what we aspire to do with all our educational programs. And yet, in times of increased tension, states mobilize and instrumentalize knowledge, scientific knowledge in particular, to their national advantage. And that is something we have to take into account, in particular in how we operationalize our international collaboration as far as research is concerned. But I think also with respect to education, do we prepare the next generation for the world as we would like it to be, or the world in which we today find ourselves in, which is a world in which the UN is powerless, in which we as academic institutions have to rebuild the shields to deal with that tension that is now prevalent all around us.
I want to add something to what Alexander is saying. We were sensing this also, let's say, some time ago, and therefore through the International Council, I made it clear that every new memorandum of understanding with whatever university, wherever in the world, should be screened. Of course, I don't think that there's any danger in a memorandum of understanding with the University of Amsterdam. But anyway, they are screened briefly, and it's now included that if it's just an umbrella, okay, then the ethical committee gives his opinion, but it is clear that whatever scientific collaboration that starts goes again to that scientific ethical committee to make sure that military misuse and dual use and so is screened for. And it starts with simple memorandum of understanding that can include student exchange, for instance. But anyway, if we want to protect us from some regimes, we have to be straightforward and have every memorandum screened. If not, we are a priori excluding. And this might come, but I want to avoid this.
Can I just...
No, go ahead.
No, please, if you want, go ahead.
My point is more on reneging on the commitments, because we frequently forget that Russia also reneged on its commitment to serve as a security guarantee of Ukraine's statehood. Many of us don't remember then after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine inherited close to 5,000 strategic nuclear warheads, and it was transferred back to Russia at that time as a part of the memorandum of understanding that UK, US, and Russia would serve as security guarantee of Ukraine's statehood. So here we are. We're reneging on them.
Just very briefly on 2 points. I think when it comes to sensitive tech transfer, that universities ought to go beyond screening memoranda of understanding. Often authoritarian countries, and it's not only China, there are several, have a very fine-grained program to drop individual researchers in different programs and to follow up. Now, that's very sensitive because, like, banning them aches to racism almost. Can you say that we don't accept Chinese students in research related to artificial intelligence? Question mark. I would be very cautious by doing that throughout the board, but screening formal agreements is not enough. It's not going to work to stop. I think what's going to be an increased, more aggressive, and more tailor-made approach of certain countries to get to our know-how in sensitive domains. And I think we at the university, for instance, we now have this big plan to do a lot on artificial intelligence, which is fantastic, but it comes with a very significant security risk. And I think we should be aware of that. That's first point. Because otherwise, 10 years down the road, we're going to see essentially China attacking Taiwan with drones that run on our artificial intelligence. And then we can say, oh gosh, yeah, well, at that time it was still different. But essentially it's going to be the same as what we are seeing with Russia and Ukraine. Second, I would reiterate very forcefully Alexander's point. I think the core business of universities remains to prepare, let's say, the vanguard of the society of tomorrow for preserving our position in a turbulent world and getting to deal with the world as it exists, but also to have the tenacity and the skills and the knowledge and the wisdom and the perseverance to make sure that in this turbulent world we continue to preserve the power to defend our ideals. I'm of the opinion that in a tough world, you should not drop your ideals, but you should, as I think Artem also stated in a way, have youngsters ready to defend these ideals. So ultimately, I think what universities should be judged on still remains the quality of education. And the extent to which not only we kind of churn out degrees and certificates, but the extent to which we enable the next generation to defend what's dear to us, to defend our values. And I think that's what we're up to. If we talk about engaged university, that's what the engagement should be, and all the rest, perhaps it's a bit blunt, but that's side business.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Other questions from the audience? Yes, there's a question up there.
Okay, thank you, first of all, for your insights. It's been very interesting. You've stated today that alarm bells have been ringing for quite some time over what we've seen now happen in Ukraine. A parallelism that I can draw is the alarm bells that have been ringing for a while for the growing Russian influence in the Western Balkans. Now, I have two questions surrounding this. A, will the situation in Ukraine prompt the EU to finally take note of these alarm bells? And B, do you see a possibility of conflict, of the region being engulfed in conflict yet again?
I think, but this is no more than a guess, that the European Union will take a good look at what is currently going on in the Balkans, because it is clearly recognized that that is in the contest of political wills with Russia. It's another front where, from an European perspective, the stakes are extremely high. So I would bet on the system of European diplomacy taking this seriously. Now, what the local dynamics are in the region is something that probably in the different capitals is only understood to a limited extent. So I think it requires engagement and dialogue with local partners as much as possible to sort of think this through. I would guess there would be a lot of willingness to sort of accelerate whatever was already planned, I remain as curious as you are to where this all will lead us. But I would remain cautiously optimistic on that front.
Okay, thank you. We had a question up there as well. I don't know.
Good evening. Thank you very much. It was very insightful, the contributions. I'm not one of your students. I must admit, and I'm sorry for that, I am an unpaid spy for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I won't say which one. But let me first explain the role of a diplomat and the role of a politician. A diplomat prepares possible solutions. And sometimes we diplomats, we think we know best, and we know best. At least I know best. But the minister then says, no, thank you. And then you present the same paper a second time, because you think the minister is clever, I'm clever, he should act on our paper, because this is just brilliant. And then again, he says, no, thank you. And then among colleagues, you say, this is weird. I mean, we have such a bright solution for Yugoslavia, and now we have one for the Krim, and he doesn't listen. And then among us, we decide who is going to attack the minister when he goes to lunch on Friday after his Council of Ministers. And I always lose that battle. I used to lose that battle, and I was the one approaching our Minister of Foreign Affairs with the same question he heard already 3 times. I shouldn't tell you how his reaction was. He said, I have a headache, leave me alone. So that's a little bit of the reality. I mean, on theory and on paper is one thing. Getting the attention of a politician who has limited attention and who has to decide to pay attention to what problem first. And of course, what happens in Ruddervoorde, I just, out of the top of my head, I named this village, is much more important to the minister, unfortunately, for the people in Ukraine or in Lviv or in Kiev. You see, that's one thing, a role of a diplomat. It is not the diplomats who will find a solution. They will present the solution, but the politicians have to act on it. So don't blame the diplomats. Then the UN. I had the honor to prepare for the minister a speech for the UN on, what was it? Ecology and conflict in Africa for the Munich conference. The UN, actually, when I started out, when I was your age, I thought, well, the UN has to solve it. Why doesn't the UN do something? But of course, you have to study with Professor Holslag, perhaps, or with Professor, with Alexander. Then you will understand that the UN is just the power of all members individually. So the UN only has the power that the countries are willing to give it. But of course, politicians, they like to say, this is something for the EU, this is something for the UN, and it certainly isn't something for me. Third, you always know when there's a diplomat in the room because he takes the floor unannounced, but I had a question. Does anyone from the panel has an idea what was in the 15-point negotiation document and how it would compare to the ultimatum, to the ultimatum the Russians put forward?
I will have to take my notes for that question.
That's then for in the bar, because I have a second one, an easy one this time, so you will pass the exam. Professor. Yeah, an easy one. Actually, there are several wars going on. There is the war, the military war, there is the information war, there is the economic war. And I think, and I wonder what you think, how these three interact. Because they interact. One, they play out at the same time. And so I'm afraid, and actually my butcher and my baker are afraid, and my son's coach in the soccer club is afraid, that this will play out very badly. Because economic sanctions, and I think Alexander spoke about that, you're part of the conflict. Don't pretend you're neutral. You're not neutral. You just don't fight. And this, at some point, we will have to pay for in cash. So how do you see the interaction between the information war that actually Ukraine's president is winning, I think, the economic war that perhaps we will be winning, because you certainly had a point that the pain threshold of the Russian people is much higher than mine and yours. And then third, the military campaign. Please explain me, Professor Holslag, you lecture to military commanders. How is it possible that in the 21st century, Russia wages a medieval war encircling the castle and using World War II tactics like just bombing? I mean, we thought the Russians were much more advanced. So I don't understand that it's such a traditional, old-fashioned 20th century war. Voilà.
A reaction to that.
Okay. Well, when it comes to assessing Russia's military capabilities, a lot of the assessments ask the initial question, to which extent can Russia open a military umbrella, so-called anti-access area denial, all missiles, aircraft and stuff, to enforce its claims in its immediate vicinity? The question was much less like, does Russia has the capacity to attack and annexate a territorially large country such as Ukraine? There has been some tabletop exercises in the US and other places, and the conclusion was never really, really decisive. When the tactical nuclear thing was brought in, also conclusion was not straightforward. Why has Russia been failing? I think it's too soon to say. Like, of course, most of the people say that Putin was overconfident, probably so. That there were ailments in the logistic, probably so. But first of all, hubris is part of warfare, I think, across the board. Like when we saw us going to fight against the terrorists and doing regime change in Iraq, like we also made mistakes, very significant mistakes, I would say. Secondly, I think it's just a misconception that warfare has been very much advanced. Like when you consider all recent episodes of urban warfare, they were medieval, they were bloody, they were extended. Like the main episodes in Iraq, for instance, like Mosul, which was a bit of our campaign, we led from behind. We sent the drones over, we sent some cruise missiles in from time to time. We had intelligence shared with the Iraqi, we had special forces supporting Iraqi troops. But from the moment that the Iraqi went in, it wasn't clean and advanced and sophisticated either. That was a very brutal war, and it lasted very, very long. So I think we just, through our kind of lack of interest, I would say, in the first place, and also filtered news that came at us, have largely ignored that all wars in the last 30 years have been quite bloody. Perhaps less casualties on our side, especially in the global war on terror, but the reality often on the battlefield was very, very much complex. But the thing is, like, warfare increasingly became like this leading from behind. We train local troops, we give them weapons, we give them intel, and then we see what happens. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But Alexander certainly will also have things to tell about that.
Well, I would perhaps just add, I don't subscribe to the analysis that there are different wars taking place. There is one big political conflict between Russia and the West taking place, of which the war in Ukraine is a symptom. And we try and speak about different wars to avoid recognizing that, as you have already previewed, to admit that we are already in a state of conflict with the Russian Federation. Now, we find ourselves on Belgian territory. Belgium in 1993 negotiated and signed a friendship treaty with the Russian Federation. A friendship treaty that today is still, legally speaking, in effect. Although we are actually sending weapons to Ukraine, we are criticizing Russia in the UN, and we are still in the process of coming to terms that we today find ourselves really in a state of conflict, which is not yet, and hopefully can be avoided, to become a military conflict. Actually, I can say something positive about the UN here, namely that in January, when all the major powers already had a sense of where this was going, committed themselves to an agreement amongst the nuclear weapon states that are the 5 permanent Security Council members, that a nuclear war cannot be won. So in effect, the recourse that everyone is having to economic pressure, to sanctions, to limited military campaigning, that is to say limited in Ukraine, is a manifestation thereof, but the fundamental reality remains that there is a big state of conflict between the entire Western liberal democratic system and the Russian Federation. And China is sort of trying to stay out as long as possible, but ultimately we sort of can guess where this is all going.
Okay, thank you. We still have a final statement, so I already invite Laura de Grijve on stage, but I want to thank, of course, also the panel members for this very relevant and interesting discussion. So please join me in thanking the speakers. And then I happily give the floor to Laura de Grijve, who is an alumnus of the VUB as well, and who is currently working for Red Cross Flanders. We will find you a microphone, Laura, so you can give your statement. Thank you.
Ja, dat mag.
Okay, Laura, please go ahead. I will change your slides.
Good evening. It's my honor to stand here and especially follow a full panel of professors of the VB. So my name is Laura de Grijve. I'm head of the International Humanitarian Law Unit at the Belgian Red Cross Flanders. I have studied at the VB. I studied political science and law, and I'm a proud alumni. My presentation is regarding 3 points. I will highlight the humanitarian situation nowadays in Ukraine. I will also highlight the activities of the Red Cross in Ukraine. And then I will close off with some messages that we try to disseminate on international humanitarian law. On a personal note, I heard about international humanitarian law for the first time as a student here at the VUB. Yeah, thank you. I don't want to overlap with the previous presentations, but the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, of course, the residents in eastern Ukraine have already endured 8 years of conflict. However, the last 3 weeks we saw an intensification and a spread of the conflict throughout the country that risks a scale of death and destruction that are frightening to contemplate given the immense military capacities involved. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine is increasingly dire and desperate. In just a handful, few weeks, homes have been reduced to rubble. Families have been huddled underground for hours to seek safety and away from shelling. Hundreds of thousands of people have no food, water, heating, electricity, and medical care. Heat facilities struggle to cope. It was mentioned before, but 3 million people have crossed the borders into neighboring countries, such as Moldova, Romania, Poland, Hungary. But also millions of people are displaced internally in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands are trapped in cities that are desperate for a safe escape, who are unable to leave or evacuated due to the continuing hostilities. They need an urgent respite from the violence, a safe passage out of the hostility zones, and humanitarian assistance. Today, our concern also regards Mariupol. Mariupol, a city of more than 400,000 people, where there is a total lack of basic necessities like food, water, and medicine. There is no specific agreement for safe passage for the moment for civilians to get out of the city, which is desperately needed. Aid cannot structurally enter. Although earlier this week, approximately 11,000 of people were able to leave Mariupol, the city has more than hundreds of thousands of people who are still waiting for evacuations. Then I turn to my second point. I know it's getting late also. What about the Red Cross? The Red Cross has a mandate to elevate human suffering wherever it exists, mainly in emergencies like armed conflicts and after natural disasters. We have received a mandate through the treaties, the Geneva Conventions, but also the statutes of the movement to facilitate humanitarian aid, to come into the aid of people in need. The Red Cross movement, it's a worldwide network existing out of 3 components. You have the International Committee of the Red Cross, you have 192 national societies, and you have the International Federation. The 3 components together combine a world network, and of course you know that we are present in almost every country today. Focusing on Ukraine, the International Committee of the Red Cross has more than 600 staff members present in Ukraine, and we are sending in more people to help and upscale our response. The Ukrainian Red Cross has more than 500 staff members and more than 5,000 volunteers. Of course, this is not enough. We are scaling our responses. However, our activities are now focusing on the dialogue with the parties to the conflict. So the International Committee of the Red Cross maintains a dialogue, as in every conflict, with the parties to the conflict to remind them about the obligations they have under international humanitarian law. They also are in dialogue with the parties now regarding the humanitarian corridors, where we all heard about in the last few weeks, and where I will come back to in a moment. We are also working to restore water infrastructure, but also distributing humanitarian relief items, and so on. Maybe one more slide. And also the International Committee of the Red Cross has a mandate to visit prisoners of war. This is also something that is sometimes forgotten or not paid attention to, but it's a right, and it's established under international humanitarian law. The Ukrainian Red Cross has provided first aid trainings also for people seeking shelter in metro stations and train stations, because of course first aid is also a way of helping other people. And so only in Kiev they trained 12,000 of people to help them also to get help to the wounded. The Ukrainian Red Cross is also supporting local evacuations, and I have to emphasize that you have to make a difference between local evacuations and humanitarian corridors on one hand, and of course also that doesn't mean like evacuations across borders. So what is the Ukrainian Red Cross doing? They are sometimes supporting local authorities to, for example, evacuate people from a certain building that got damaged from a certain attack. The humanitarian corridors, that is up to the parties to the conflict to negotiate, to get to an agreement, but also to discuss all the modalities and concrete arrangements that have to be made. So they have to agree about the timing, the location, the safe passage routes, and so on. It's not up to the Red Cross to do so. However, once an agreement is reached, it's the Red Cross who can act as a neutral intermediary between the parties to the conflict and make sure that people are willing and in a dignified way can be evacuated. The distributions of emergency items is also an example. When the conflict escalated, before that escalation, the Red Cross had stocks in country, of course, already. However, those stocks were very fast depleted. And so we had to do a whole mobilization as a Red Cross movement to set up new logistic hubs in the neighboring countries to get aid into the country. And we saw already a few success stories. It's a very small drop in the ocean. However, several humanitarian aid convoys already reached Ukraine from the Red Cross. One example is earlier this week, a convoy of 11 trucks arrived in Ukraine with 200 tons of relief items, including like blankets, jerry cans, or buckets for water, medical kits to treat people who are affected with war wounds, especially because that's our like very specific materials that are needed, and so on. And of course, the Ukrainian Red Cross is working in Ukraine together with the International Committee of the Red Cross, but they are supported by the broader International Red Cross Red Crescent movement. So also in the border areas, in the neighboring countries, there is a Red Cross active, and so we are supporting people who are arriving, who are crossing borders, to give them temporary shelter, but also the basic necessities. We also pay a lot of attention to families, and especially maintaining contacts between families by, for example, providing them with SIM cards, but also there is a specific service of the Red Cross called Restoring Family Links, and that is someone or a service that you can contact whenever you lost contact with your family member in Ukraine or across borders. You can go ahead. I brought some pictures of activities of, this is in Ukraine. You can go on. This is in one of the neighboring countries. I forgot the location. Hungary, yes, it's on the slide. This was taking place today. The president of the International Committee of the Red Cross is in Kiev now to discuss with the authorities about the humanitarian needs, but also on international humanitarian law. This is a convoy that took place actually earlier this week out of Sumy, one of the cities in Ukraine that was also desperately needing for help. And that was a convoy of at least 80 buses. And it was facilitated with a Red Cross guidance. This is one of the warehouses where we have the relief items being collected, and then they are going through different places in Ukraine. This is distribution of water. And then I'm coming back to my last point, and that's, of course, international law. So what we stress in Ukraine, in the neighboring countries, but also in Belgium, is that all parties to the conflict have to respect international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law is a set of rules that seeks to limit the humanitarian consequences of a conflict, an armed conflict, by, for example, prohibiting or limiting certain use of weapons and methods of warfare, and on the other hand, providing a very clear set of rules on who is protected under international humanitarian law. For example, people who are not or no longer participating in the hostilities receive a certain protection under international humanitarian law. So this is a message that is very important in this kind of conflicts, in all armed conflicts, of course, and we must not forget that besides Ukraine, many other armed conflicts, unfortunately, are taking place today. One more back, sorry. One of the messages that we stress is, of course, to ensure the protection of the civilian population and critical civilian infrastructure, and of course also to protect the space for neutral, impartial humanitarian action. It is an obligation under the international humanitarian law to allow and facilitate humanitarian relief and access for humanitarian organizations such as the Red Cross. And then I'm coming to my end, but I was asked also to answer the question, what can you do? And I would say that you can support, of course, the Red Cross in any way you want, here or abroad. You can also help us to spread the message that IHL should be respected, to spread knowledge about IHL, through social media, for example, and I'm looking at the young people in the room. And maybe also, I would say, take some caution about what you are spreading as information about the conflict. Because we know that there is disinformation, and it's important that you verify the sources. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Laura. Any questions for Laura? Final questions? If not, I think we can end the evening here. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to again thank the speakers who participated today, and thank you again, Laura, for coming and sharing your ideas as well. So thank you.